Close your eyes for a moment. Let your breath deepen and allow your mind to drift back in time. Imagine a vast empire stretching from the sun-scorched deserts to the snow-capped mountains. Picture its magnificent cities with soaring towers and bustling marketplaces filled with exotic goods from 100 different lands. See the legions marching in perfect unison, their polished armor glinting in the sun, a symbol of unshakable power and order. This is an empire at its zenith, a civilization that believes itself eternal, a beacon of culture and strength that will shine for 1,000 years. Its people go about their days with a sense of security, their lives woven into the grand tapestry of this enduring state. The emperor is wise, the harvests are plentiful, and the borders are secure. It feels as if this golden age will never end, but change, like a gentle, almost imperceptible tide, begins to creep in. It doesn't arrive with the crash of a conquering army or the fury of a sudden rebellion. It is subtle. It is a slight shift in the wind, a shadow that lengthens just a little bit each day, unnoticed by those who are too busy with their lives. It might start with a whisper in a far-flung province, a story of a minor border skirmish that is quickly dismissed in the capital. Perhaps it's a small crack in a grand aqueduct, a trivial repair that gets postponed. Or maybe it's a new idea, a different way of thinking that begins to spread quietly among the merchants and scholars. A seed of dissent planted in the fertile ground of complacency. Empires, you see, rarely collapse in a single dramatic day. They don't shatter like glass. Instead, they fade. They erode, slowly, grain by grain, like a sandstone cliff worn down by a patient sea. The grand edifice of power begins to weaken from within, long before any external threat becomes apparent. Tonight, we're not going to talk about the great battles or the famous last stands. We're going to explore the quiet moments in between, the slow, creeping decay of great civilizations. We'll journey through the twilight years of mighty empires, listening to the echoes of their gradual decline. This is not a story of sudden catastrophe, but of a long, slow goodbye. So, get comfortable, let the weight of the day fall away, and allow my voice to be your guide as we drift through the annals of history, witnessing the quiet, inevitable fading of the light. Let us begin our journey with Rome, not the Rome of Caesar or Augustus, but a later Rome, a Rome that has grown old and perhaps a little weary. The city is still grand, the Colosseum still stands, but the vibrant energy has begun to wane. For generations, the legions held the line, but now, the cost of maintaining such a massive army is becoming a crushing burden. The silver mines that once funded the empire are running dry. To pay the soldiers, emperors start to debase the currency, mixing less precious metals into the silver coins. At first, no one really notices. A denarius is a denarius, but soon, merchants become wary. They realize the coins in their hands are not as pure as they once were. To protect themselves, they begin to raise their prices. Inflation, a silent economic disease, begins to infect the empire. Trade, the lifeblood of the empire, begins to slow. It becomes safer to hoard goods than to sell them for currency that is losing its value. Simultaneously, a political malaise sets in. The succession of emperors becomes less about merit and more about military might. A successful general, popular with his troops, can march on Rome and declare himself emperor. This leads to a century of chaos, with emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. Some rule for only a few months before they are assassinated by a rival. This constant turmoil at the top creates instability throughout the provinces. How can a governor plan for the future when the central authority is in a perpetual state of flux? The intricate system of Roman law and administration, once its greatest strength, begins to fray at the edges. Local strongmen, or landlords, begin to take matters into their own hands, offering protection to the local populace in exchange for their loyalty and labor. Slowly, power begins to shift away from the central government in Rome and toward these regional magnates. The empire is not being conquered. It is simply dissolving, breaking apart into smaller, self-sufficient pieces. The grand, unified whole is becoming a patchwork of localized power. Now, let our thoughts drift eastward across the vast plains of Asia to the great Tang dynasty of China. Like Rome, it was a civilization of immense cultural achievement and power. Its capital, Chang'an, was the most populous city in the world, a cosmopolitan hub where poets, artists, and monks from across Asia gathered. The Silk Road flourished, bringing immense wealth and new ideas. But here, too, the seeds of decline were sown in times of prosperity. These governors were entrusted with immense power to defend the long borders. Over time, these positions became hereditary. Fathers passed their command and their armies to their sons. These regional powers grew stronger and stronger, while the central court in Chang'an became consumed by intrigue and the lavish excesses of imperial life. The emperor, surrounded by eunuchs and court officials, grew distant from the realities of his vast domain. The turning point was the An Lushan Rebellion. A powerful general of non-Chinese descent, An Lushan used his formidable army to rebel against the Tang court. The central government had to grant even more autonomy to the regional governors in order to win back their loyalty. The Temps never fully recovered its authority. The empire that emerged was a shadow of its former self. The central treasury was empty, the tax system was in ruins, and the military governors now acted as independent warlords, ruling their territories as personal fiefdoms. The decline was slow and agonizing. For another 150 years, the Thames dynasty would continue to exist in name, but its golden age was a distant memory. They were a collection of powerful city-states like Tikal, Calakmul, and Palenque that competed, traded, and warred with one another. For centuries, these cities flourished, building breathtaking pyramids, developing a complex writing system, and creating a calendar of astonishing accuracy. Their kings were seen as divine intermediaries, responsible for maintaining the cosmic balance through elaborate rituals. But around the 9th century, something began to go profoundly wrong. In the southern lowlands, the heartland of Maya civilization, the great cities began to be abandoned. People simply walked away from the stone cities their ancestors had built over generations, and the jungle began its patient work of reclamation. What happened? The answer is not simple. It's a tapestry of interwoven factors. One leading theory points to prolonged and severe drought. The Maya civilization was heavily dependent on sophisticated water management systems, reservoirs, and canals to support large populations in a region with seasonal rainfall. As the climate shifted and the rains failed, season after season, these systems were pushed to their breaking point, and the bounty of the earth found their legitimacy crumbling. How could they be divine when the skies refused to give rain and the corn withered in the fields? The constant warfare between city-states likely exacerbated the crisis, destroying farmland and disrupting trade routes. The environment, strained by deforestation, to clear land for agriculture and to produce the lime plaster for their magnificent buildings, could no longer support the dense populations. It wasn't a sudden cataclysm. It was a slow, agonizing, environmental and social collapse. The fading of the Maya was a quiet tragedy, a civilization returning to the earth from which it sprang, leaving behind silent, vine-covered ruins as the only testament to its former glory. As you feel yourself sinking deeper into relaxation, let your mind rest on these stories. The end is not a moment of terror, but a slow release, a final, quiet exhalation. Let this sense of peaceful release wash over you. Let go of the day's worries and concerns. They are but fleeting moments in the grand sweep of time. Allow your body to feel heavy and relaxed, your mind calm and still. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just rest here in this quiet space and let the gentle current of sleep carry you away. Good night. Come a little closer and let's journey back in time to a world lit by oil lamps and moonlight. Tonight, we're not telling a story of brave heroes or thrilling battles, but a quieter tale. A story of something vast and powerful, slowly, gently, fading away, like the last embers of a campfire. Imagine an empire so enormous it stretched across continents, a single thread of power connecting sun-scorched deserts to misty northern forests. This was Rome. For centuries, its heart, the city of Rome itself, pulsed with life, sending out roads, laws, and legions to every corner of the known world. From the sands of Egypt to the rainy isles of Britain, people lived under the eagle banner of the Roman Empire. They traded goods, shared ideas, and for a long, long time, they knew a kind of peace, the Pax Romana. It was a time of grand buildings, of poets and philosophers, a time when it seemed this great empire would last forever, as eternal as the stars. But nothing, not even the mightiest empire, can remain unchanged. Slowly, so slowly, you might not even notice it at first, things began to shift. The vibrant pulse of the empire began to weaken. The once bright flame began to flicker. It didn't happen overnight, not with a crash or a bang, but more like a long, slow sigh. The story of Rome's twilight is not one of dramatic endings, but of gradual change, a gentle letting go. Now, let's drift back to those later days of the empire. The great city of Rome, once the undisputed center of the world, was starting to feel the strain. Think of it like a grand old house that's just become too big to manage. The money that once flowed in from conquered lands began to slow to a trickle. To pay for the massive army and the sprawling government, emperors started making coins with less silver in them. It was like trying to bake a big cake with only half the sugar. It just wasn't the same. People began to lose faith in the value of their money. Prices for everyday things, like bread and oil, began to climb higher and higher, making life difficult for ordinary families. The rich grew richer, hiding their wealth on vast country estates, while the poor in the cities struggled. The bustling marketplaces, once a symbol of Rome's prosperity, grew a little quieter. The hum of commerce a little fainter. The economic heart of the empire was tired. At the same time, the political world was like a stormy sea. In the old days, an emperor might rule for decades, providing stability. But now, the throne became a dangerous prize. Ambitious generals, with the loyalty of their soldiers, would march on Rome, fighting each other for the title of emperor. In one chaotic period of just 50 years, more than 20 men claimed the title, and most of them met a violent end. Imagine trying to steer a giant ship when the captain keeps changing every few years, each one pointing the vessel in a different direction. It was confusing and unsettling for everyone. The laws became inconsistent, trust in the government faded, and a feeling of instability crept across the land. The solid foundation of Roman power was cracking, not from one mighty blow, but from 1,000 tiny fractures. And while things were crumbling from within, the edges of the empire were feeling the pressure. Imagine a huge, sprawling garden with a very long fence. For centuries, that fence, manned by the disciplined Roman legions, had kept the garden safe. But now, the fence was starting to get gaps in it. The empire was simply too big to defend everywhere at once. From the dense forests of Germany, tribes the Romans called barbarians began to press against the borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers. In the east, a powerful new Persian empire challenged Roman authority. The legions, stretched thin and often more loyal to their generals than to the emperor in a distant city, were constantly marching from one crisis to another. It was an endless, exhausting effort to patch up the borders, putting out one fire only for another to start somewhere else. The once impenetrable shield of Roman military might was growing heavy and weary. The outside world was knocking, and the doors were no longer as strong as they once were. Feeling the immense strain, one emperor named Diocletian had a radical idea. He decided the empire was too large for one person to rule alone, so he split it. He created a system with 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, to manage the vast territories more effectively. For a while, this seemed to work. It was like having 4 gardeners for that giant, sprawling garden instead of just one. But this division, meant to save the empire, also planted the seeds of its permanent separation. The western half, with its capital still in Italy, and the eastern half, with its growing focus on a new city, began to drift apart. They developed their own distinct characters, spoke different primary languages, Latin in the west, Greek in the east, and faced different challenges. Another emperor, Constantine, would later move the capital of the entire empire to a new city he built, Constantinople. This magnificent city, strategically placed between Europe and Asia, became the heart of the Eastern Empire. It was a brilliant, vibrant new center of power, but it also drew resources, talent, and attention away from the old western half. The old heart of Rome was being left behind, beating more and more faintly as the empire's energy flowed eastward. As the Western Roman Empire weakened, something remarkable happened. Groups of people from beyond the borders, the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, began to move into Roman territory. It wasn't always a violent invasion, as we might imagine. Sometimes, they were invited in as allies, asked to serve in the Roman army or to farm empty lands. They were drawn by the allure of Roman civilization, its stability and wealth, even as that stability was fading. For a long time, there was a mix of cultures, a blending of Roman and Germanic traditions. But as the central government in the West lost its grip, these groups began to form their own independent kingdoms on Roman soil. In Gaul, the Franks established a kingdom that would one day become France. In Spain, the Visigoths took control, and in a shocking event that echoed across the world, a group of Visigoths even sacked the city of Rome itself. It wasn't the end, but it was a sign that the old order was gone. The mighty eagle was being replaced by new flags. The year often remembered is 476 AD. In that year, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a young boy, ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. There was no great battle, no dramatic last stand at the city gates. Odoacer simply told the boy emperor that he was no longer needed and sent him into a comfortable retirement. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to a story that had spanned 1,000 years. The Western Roman Empire didn't so much fall as it simply dissolved, breaking apart into smaller pieces, like a beautiful mosaic tile by tile. But this wasn't an ending for everyone. In the East, the empire, which we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive from its capital in Constantinople. It carried the legacy of Rome for another 1,000 years, preserving its laws, its art, and its knowledge. So the light of Rome never truly went out. It changed, it transformed, and it was passed on. The new kingdoms in the West, though different, built upon the foundations Rome had left behind. Roman law influenced their legal systems. The Latin language evolved into French, Spanish, and Italian, and the roads the legions had built continued to connect people and towns. The story of Rome's long twilight is a gentle reminder that even the greatest things come to a quiet end. But their legacy, their echo, can ripple through time in ways we can't even imagine. And now, as the story closes, let the quiet of history settle around you. Let the echoes of ancient Rome fade into the peaceful stillness of the night. Sleep well. Imagine, for a moment, a city lost to time, not a ghost town of dust and tumbleweeds, but a metropolis swallowed whole by the jungle. Towering stone pyramids, once the heart of a vibrant civilization, now wear a cloak of green moss and tangled vines. Monkeys swing from temple doorways where priests once chanted, and the roar of the jaguar has replaced the clamor of 1,000,000 voices. These are the lost cities of the Maya, scattered across Mexico and Central America, silent monuments to a world that simply vanished. For over 2,000 years, the Maya thrived. They built architectural wonders that rivaled those of ancient Egypt and Rome. They developed a writing system more complex than any other in the pre-Columbian Americas, and their understanding of astronomy was breathtakingly precise. Cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Karakol were bustling centers of trade, art, and intellectual life, home to hundreds of thousands of people. Their plazas would have been a kaleidoscope of color and sound merchants, hawking jade and obsidian, scribes recording royal histories on bark paper, and the rhythmic beat of drums accompanying sacred ceremonies. From the ground, these cities must have felt eternal, their stone structures reaching for the heavens, seemingly as permanent as the stars they so carefully mapped. What could possibly bring such a brilliant civilization to its knees? How does a world teeming with life fall silent? The story of the Maya's decline isn't a single dramatic event. It's not a tale of a sudden cataclysm or a swift conquest. Instead, it's a slow, complex unraveling, a perfect storm of pressures that gradually wore down the foundations of their society. It's a story that whispers to us from the very stones and soil of their abandoned cities. Let's peel back the layers of jungle and time to understand what happened. One of the most powerful clues lies hidden in the mud at the bottom of ancient lakes. Scientists have drilled deep into these sediment layers, which act like a natural archive, trapping pollen, charcoal, and chemical signatures from centuries past. What they found tells a stark story of water, or more accurately, a lack of it. Around the 9th century AD, The Yucatan Peninsula was gripped by a series of prolonged, devastating droughts. We're not talking about a few dry years. We're talking about mega-droughts, some lasting for decades. For a civilization so dependent on agriculture, this was catastrophic. The Maya were master farmers. They had developed sophisticated systems of canals, reservoirs, and terraced fields to manage their water supply and grow maize, beans, and squash, the trilogy of life that sustained their population. But even their ingenuity couldn't defy the climate. As the rains failed, year after year, the reservoirs dried up. The once lush fields turned to dust. The maize, which was not just food, but a sacred element of their cosmology, withered on the stalk. Imagine the growing panic as the communal granaries emptied and the prayers to the rain god Chalk went unanswered. Famine wasn't just a threat. It became a grim reality. The water crisis was made worse by another factor, the sheer number of people. At its peak, the Mayan population was dense, with some cities supporting more people per square mile than many modern European countries. To feed everyone, vast swaths of jungle were cleared for farmland. This deforestation had an unintended and disastrous side effect. Trees play a crucial role in the water cycle, drawing moisture from the soil and releasing it into the atmosphere, which helps create clouds and rain. As the forests disappeared, the land became less able to retain water, and local rainfall patterns were disrupted, making the droughts even more severe. It was a vicious cycle. The need for more food led to more deforestation, which in turn led to less rain and less food. The very success of the Maya in growing their population had planted the seeds of their own environmental crisis. As resources grew scarce, the delicate social and political fabric of Mayan society began to fray. The Maya were not a single, unified empire, but a collection of powerful city-states, each ruled by a divine king or a jah. These rulers were seen as intermediaries between the human world and the gods. Their legitimacy rested on their ability to ensure prosperity, bring the rains, and secure victory in battle. When the rains failed and the harvests shriveled, the people's faith in their leaders began to waver. How could a king be divine if he couldn't even persuade the gods to send rain? This crisis of faith fueled intense competition and conflict. Inscriptions carved on stone monuments, known as stelae, shift in tone during this period. Where they once celebrated religious rituals and astronomical events, they began to boast more and more of war, captives, and conquest. City-states that had long been rivals, like Tikal and Calakmul, escalated their conflicts. Warfare became more frequent and more brutal, not just for ritual prestige, but for control of dwindling resources like water and fertile land. This constant state of war drained resources, destroyed farmland, and displaced populations. It further destabilized a society already reeling from hunger and thirst. The kings, in a desperate bid to reassert their authority, may have demanded ever larger temples and more elaborate ceremonies, placing even greater strain on their starving subjects. While the southern heartland was collapsing under the weight of drought and war, something else was happening. The economic map of the region was being redrawn. For centuries, the major Mayan trade routes had run over land, connecting the great inland cities. But around the 9th and 10th centuries, a shift began to occur. New, more efficient maritime trade routes started to develop along the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula and around the Gulf of Mexico. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a new superhighway being built, bypassing the old towns. Cities located along these new coastal routes, like Chichen Itza in the north, began to flourish. They controlled the flow of valuable goods like salt, honey, and cotton, growing rich and powerful. Meanwhile, the once mighty inland cities found themselves increasingly isolated. Their trade networks withered, and their economic power evaporated. This economic shift was the final nail in the coffin for many southern cities. They were environmentally stressed, politically unstable, and now economically irrelevant. There was no single day when the Maya decided to leave. It was a gradual exodus, a slow bleeding of population over decades, perhaps even a century. Families, then entire villages, simply packed up what little they had and walked away. They weren't fleeing a conquering army, but an invisible one: hunger, thirst, and despair. And behind them, the jungle began its patient reclamation. Vines crept over palace walls. Tree roots buckled the floors of great plazas. The roar of the city was replaced by the hum of insects and the call of birds. It teaches us that climate change, resource depletion, and social conflict are not just modern problems, but ancient challenges that have shaped the course of human history. Their descendants are still here today, millions of them living across Central America, speaking their ancestral languages and practicing traditions that blend ancient beliefs with new ones. The great cities may be silent, but the spirit of the Maya, their resilience, and their culture lives on. Thank you for joining me on this exploration. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified of our next adventure. Imagine a city, not just of buildings and streets, but of ideas, a place where the greatest minds of an era gathered, where libraries held more books than entire continents, and where starlight was charted with an accuracy that would astound later generations. This was Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, a beacon of civilization that shone brightly for centuries. In its heyday, the House of Wisdom wasn't just a library, it was an engine of discovery, translating and expanding upon the knowledge of the Greeks, Persians, and Indians. From mathematics and medicine to philosophy and astronomy, Baghdad was the undisputed center of the intellectual world. It was a city of 1 million people when London was just a small town. Its markets were filled with goods from China to Spain. Its gardens were legendary, and its palaces were marvels of architecture. This was the Baghdad of stories, the city of Harun al-Rashid, a name synonymous with justice, prosperity, and a cultural renaissance that lit up the medieval world. It's a vision that seems almost dreamlike now, a testament to what humanity can achieve. But dreams, like empires, can fade. The story of Baghdad is not just one of brilliant ascent, but also of a slow, painful decline. The city that once defined an age began to lose its luster long before the final, catastrophic blow. How does such a vibrant center of power and learning unravel? It wasn't a single event, but a gradual erosion, a slow bleeding of strength and spirit over centuries. The seeds of its downfall were sown within the very fabric of the empire it commanded. The sheer size of the Abbasid Caliphate became its weakness. From the distant sands of North Africa to the rugged mountains of Central Asia, governors appointed to rule far-flung provinces began to see themselves less as servants of the Caliph and more as kings in their own right. They started withholding taxes, building their own armies, and establishing hereditary dynasties. The Bides, a Persian dynasty, marched into Baghdad in 945. They didn't overthrow the Caliph. They did something far more humiliating. They kept him as a spiritual figurehead, but stripped him of all real political power. The Caliph, once the most powerful man in the world, became a puppet in his own palace, his authority reduced to a symbol, while others pulled the strings. This political fragmentation had a devastating effect. The vast wealth that once flowed into Baghdad from across the empire dwindled to a trickle. Without that constant stream of revenue, the caliphs could no longer fund the grand projects, the massive armies, and the patronage of arts and sciences that had defined their golden age. The city itself began to shrink. The complex irrigation systems that fed the fertile lands around Baghdad, a marvel of engineering, fell into disrepair due to neglect and a lack of funds for maintenance. The once green landscape slowly reverted to arid dust, and agricultural output plummeted. This economic decay fueled social unrest. The population of Baghdad, once cosmopolitan and diverse, became increasingly fractured. Different factions and militias vied for control of neighborhoods, turning the city's streets into battlegrounds. The unity that had been a source of strength was replaced by suspicion and conflict. Then came another wave of conquerors from the east, the Seljuk Turks. They arrived in the mid-11th century, initially presenting themselves as protectors of the Sunni Caliph against the Shia-Beeds. They restored a degree of military order and pushed back the empire's enemies, but it came at a price. The caliph's authority was further diminished. He was now subservient to a Seljuk sultan. The Seljuks were great warriors and patrons of a particular kind of Islamic orthodoxy, but their focus was military and administrative, not the freewheeling intellectual curiosity that had characterized the early Abbasid era. While they established famous schools, the climate of open debate and philosophical inquiry began to cool. The emphasis shifted from questioning and discovery to the preservation and codification of existing knowledge. The intellectual fire of Baghdad, while not extinguished, burned less brightly. The city was no longer the sole, unrivaled center of learning it had once been. Other cities, like Cairo and Cordoba, rose to prominence, creating their own centers of culture and science, further decentralizing the Islamic world. Internally, the caliphate was also weakened by deep-seated religious and sectarian divisions. The long-standing Sunni-Shia split often erupted into violent clashes within Baghdad itself. These conflicts were exploited by ambitious leaders and external powers, further destabilizing the city and draining its resources. The caliphs, caught between powerful warlords and sectarian strife, found their ability to govern effectively almost completely eroded. Their influence rarely extended beyond the walls of their own city, and sometimes not even that far. The Baghdad of the 12th and early 13th centuries was a shadow of its former self. It was still a large and symbolically important city, but it was politically fragile, economically weakened, and intellectually past its peak. It was a magnificent, hollowed-out shell, vulnerable and unprepared for the storm that was gathering far to the east. It was a city living on the memory of its past glory, unaware that its final, tragic chapter was about to be written. This long, slow decline set the stage for the ultimate catastrophe. In 1258, a new force, unlike any the world had seen, arrived at the gates of Baghdad. The Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. They had already carved a path of destruction across Asia, and now they stood before the city of the caliphs. The reigning caliph, Al-Mustasim, was ill-advised and fatally underestimated the threat. He responded to Hulag's demands for submission with arrogance and defiance, unaware of the weakness of his own position and the terrifying power of his enemy. The siege that followed was short and brutal. The city's defenses, neglected for so long, crumbled quickly. After the city fell, what happened next is one of history's great tragedies. For weeks, the Mongols sacked Baghdad with a ferocity that shocked the world. Hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants were slaughtered. The city was systematically destroyed. And then there were the books. The libraries of Baghdad, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were ransacked. Countless volumes of knowledge, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, and literature were destroyed. Accounts tell of books being thrown into the Tigris River in such vast quantities that the water ran black with ink. Others say the books were used to build a bridge for the Mongol horses. Whether literally true or not, the image is powerful. It represents the destruction, not just of a city, but of a world of knowledge. Centuries of intellectual achievement, the legacy of generations of scholars, were wiped out in a matter of weeks. It was a cultural cataclysm from which the Islamic world would take centuries to recover. The Mongol sack was the final, devastating blow to a city already brought to its knees by a long, slow decline. It marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate and the end of Baghdad's era as the intellectual capital of the world. So what can we learn from Baghdad's fall? It's a powerful reminder that no golden age lasts forever. Greatness is not a permanent state. It requires constant maintenance, unity, and adaptation. Political division, economic neglect, and internal conflict can erode the foundations of even the mightiest civilizations, leaving them vulnerable to collapse. The story of Baghdad shows how the loss of central authority and the rise of regional powers can bleed a capital dry, both financially and culturally. It also demonstrates the danger of intellectual stagnation. When a society stops questioning, exploring, and innovating, it begins to lose the very dynamism that made it great. The shift from pioneering new ideas to simply preserving old ones was a subtle but critical part of Baghdad's decline. Yet the legacy of Baghdad did not completely vanish in the waters of the Tigris. The knowledge that was nurtured there had already spread far and wide. The works translated and developed in the House of Wisdom had made their way to Europe through Spain and Sicily, where they helped fuel the European Renaissance. The mathematics we use today, the foundations of modern medicine, and our understanding of the stars all bear the fingerprints of the scholars of Baghdad. The light of that city, though extinguished in its source, had already been passed on, and Baghdad itself, though ravaged, would eventually rise again. It would never reclaim the same global prominence, but its spirit endures as a powerful symbol of both the heights of human achievement and the fragility of civilization. It's a story of triumph and tragedy, a lesson written in the dust and ashes of history, reminding us to cherish and protect our own centers of knowledge and unity before they too become just a memory. Thank you for watching. If you found this reflection on history meaningful, consider liking and subscribing for more stories about our shared past. Imagine, for a moment, an empire so vast it stretches from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe. A dominion built by the will of one man, forged in the crucible of the steppes, linking east and west like never before. This was the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its zenith, it was a world unto itself, a sprawling tapestry of conquered peoples, bustling trade routes, and unified command. But what happens when the architect of such a colossal structure is gone? What happens when the world's largest empire is carved up like a family inheritance? This is the story of the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire, a tale not of dramatic battlefield collapse, but of a slow, inevitable fracturing from within. It's a story about how distance, culture, and human nature itself can unravel even the mightiest of creations. When Genghis Khan passed away in 1227, he left his 4 sons not a single, indivisible empire, but designated territories, or ulus, to govern. This was in line with nomadic tradition, where wealth and land were divided among the heirs. The eldest son, Joki, had passed away shortly before his father, so his lands were given to his sons Batu and Orda Chagatai. The second son received Central Asia. The third son, Agide, was named the Great Khan, the supreme ruler, and was given the heartland of Mongolia. The youngest, Tolui, as per tradition, inherited the homeland, the core territories in Mongolia. Initially, this system was designed to work in concert. The sons and grandsons were meant to rule their own domains, while recognizing the supreme authority of the Great Khan in the capital, Karakoram. For a time, it did. Under Agade Khan, the empire continued to expand, pushing further into Europe and consolidating its rule in China. The brothers cooperated, sending troops and resources to support unified campaigns. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, flourished. The Silk Road was safer than it had ever been, and goods, ideas, and people flowed freely across the continent. It seemed the great machine Genghis Khan had built would run forever, but the seeds of division were already sown. The sheer scale of the empire was its first and greatest challenge. A message sent from the capital could take months to reach the far-flung commanders in Russia or Persia. Governing such a vast and diverse territory from a single center was a logistical nightmare. Local governors and princes, operating with a great deal of autonomy due to the distance, began to develop their own interests and priorities. They were no longer just Mongol generals. They were rulers of Persia, rulers of the Rus principalities, and their day-to-day concerns were centered on their local domains, not on the distant politics of the capital. This psychological distance was just as significant as the physical miles. The longer a Mongol lineage ruled over a specific land, the more they began to identify with it. They adopted local customs, sometimes local religions, and married into local noble families. The first major crack appeared after the death of Ogide's successor, Guyuk Khan, in 1248. The subsequent succession crisis revealed the growing rift between the houses of Genghis Khan's sons. The lines were drawn between the descendants of Joki and Tolui on one side, and the descendants of Ogede and Chagatai on the other. Monkey Khan, a son of Tolui, eventually secured the title of Great Khan in 1251, but his election was contentious and achieved with a show of military force. He was a capable ruler, but he further centralized power within his own branch of the family, the Toluids. He sent his brothers to govern key parts of the empire Hulagu to Persia and Kubli to China. This move, while intended to consolidate Toluid control, effectively created powerful, semi-independent Mongol states within the empire. Hulagu went on to establish the Ilkhanate in Persia, while Kubli focused his immense ambition on conquering the rest of China. The true breaking point came with Monkey Khan's death in 1259 during a campaign in China. With no clear successor in place, his 2 younger brothers, Kublai and Arik Bok, Both declared themselves Great Khan. Arikbok was elected by the traditional Mongol nobles in the capital of Karakorum, representing the old guard who wanted to preserve the nomadic steppe traditions. Kublai, on the other hand, had the support of his powerful army in China and represented a new, more sedentary and administrative style of rule. The Toluid Civil War erupted, a devastating conflict that pitted brother against brother. For 4 years, the Mongol heartland was torn apart, while Kublai eventually emerged victorious. The cost was immense. The unity of the empire was shattered. During the war, the other Khans, like Berk of the Golden Horde and Algu of the Chagatai Neat, had used the chaos to assert their own complete independence. They chose sides, fought their own battles, and by the time the dust settled, the illusion of a single, unified empire was gone. What remained were 4 distinct successor states, each a powerful empire in its own right, but no longer bound to a single authority. In the northwest, there was the Golden Horde, ruling over the Rus and the vast Pontic-Caspian steppe. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate, founded by Hulagu. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate continued, often in a state of internal turmoil. And in the East, Kublai Khan established the Yuan dynasty in China, moving his capital to what is now Beijing and ruling as a Chinese emperor. While they were all related by blood, their political and cultural paths diverged sharply. The Ilkhans in Persia largely converted to Islam and became patrons of Persian culture. The Yuan dynasty in China adopted Chinese administrative systems and court rituals, trying to balance their Mongol identity with the task of ruling a sophisticated, ancient civilization. The Golden Horde interacted deeply with the Russian principalities and eventually adopted Islam as well. The very cultures they had conquered began to change them from within. These new empires often clashed. The Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate, for example, fought a series of bitter wars over territory in the Caucasus. These were not just border skirmishes. They were full-scale conflicts between Mongol states. The dream of a united world under a single Khan was replaced by the reality of regional power politics. The concept of the Great Khan became a purely nominal title. Though Kublai and his successors in the Yuan dynasty claimed it, the Khans of the other states paid them no real allegiance. They were, for all intents and purposes, independent sovereigns. The fragmentation was not a sudden event, but a gradual process. It was a story of family feuds escalating into civil wars, of logistical challenges becoming political divisions, and of cultural assimilation slowly eroding a common identity. The empire didn't fall to an external enemy. It simply grew too large and too diverse to hold itself together. The descendants of Genghis Khan, once united by a singular purpose, now saw themselves as Chinese emperors, Persian shahs, and steppe warlords. The world their grandfather had conquered was now their chessboard, and they played the great game against each other. Reflecting on this history, it's a powerful lesson in the nature of empires and power, the very qualities that allowed the Mongols to conquer the world, their adaptability. Their decentralized command structure on the battlefield also contained the blueprint for their eventual division. They were brilliant at conquering, but the challenge of governing was an entirely different matter. The story of the Mongol succession is a profoundly human one. It's a story of ambition, family rivalry, and the eternal tension between tradition and change. It reminds us that even the most formidable structures built by human hands are subject to the forces of time, distance, and the simple, powerful reality that sons and grandsons are not their fathers. The unified Mongol Empire was a fleeting, brilliant moment in history, and its slow, inevitable division gave birth to the new worlds that would shape the future of Asia and Europe for centuries to come. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. If you found this story fascinating, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more explorations into the past. See you next time. In the heart of a continent, nestled between snow-capped mountains and sun-scorched deserts, lay the vast expanse of the Khazarian Empire. For centuries, its name was whispered with a mix of awe and reverence. Caravans laden with silk and spices traced ancient routes across its lands, their bells echoing through bustling city bazaars. The emperors, descendants of a long and storied dynasty, ruled from the magnificent Jade Palace, their authority seemingly as eternal as the stars above. Life in the empire was a tapestry woven with threads of deep-rooted tradition. The rhythm of the seasons dictated the lives of farmers in the fertile river valleys, while artisans in crowded workshops perfected crafts handed down through generations. Philosophers and poets gathered in serene gardens, debating the nature of the cosmos and the wisdom of the ancients. The empire was a world unto itself, proud and self-sufficient, convinced of its own timeless perfection. But beyond the great wall that snaked across its northern frontier, the world was changing at a dizzying pace. Steam-powered ships from distant lands, armed with cannons that could shatter fortress walls, began to appear off the coast. They brought with them strange new goods, but also new ideas of industry, of different forms of governance, of a world connected not by caravan trails, but by iron rails and telegraph wires. At first, the imperial court dismissed these outsiders as little more than curious barbarians. What could they possibly offer a civilization that had already perfected art, governance, and philosophy? The empire, secure in its millennia of old traditions, saw no need for the noisy, smoke-belching machines of the West. This initial contact was viewed as a temporary distraction, a minor ripple on the calm surface of their imperial pond. But the ripples didn't subside. They grew into waves, and soon those waves were crashing against the very foundations of the Khazarian world. The first real shock came not from a foreign army, but from a trade imbalance. The silver that had filled the imperial coffers for centuries began to flow out, exchanged for foreign luxuries and, most insidiously, for a potent new drug that sapped the will and strength of the people. The imperial economy, built on agriculture and artisanal goods, began to falter. The price of rice, the staple food for millions, skyrocketed. Peasants, unable to pay their taxes or feed their families, grew restless. The once unquestioned prosperity of the empire was showing cracks. The court, steeped in tradition, struggled to understand the complex forces of global economics now at their doorstep. Their old solutions, issuing edicts and consulting ancient texts, proved utterly ineffective against this new invisible enemy. The economic ground beneath their feet was shifting, and the entire edifice of the empire began to feel unstable. Desperate to reassert their dominance, a faction of reform-minded officials at court argued for change. They pointed to the military might of the foreign powers and warned that without modernization, the empire would be carved up and consumed. "We must learn their ways to beat them at their own game," became their rallying cry. This led to the establishment of new arsenals and shipyards, staffed by foreign advisors. Young, ambitious officers were sent abroad to study Western military tactics. The sight of Kazgarian soldiers drilling with modern rifles and marching in disciplined formations was a jarring contrast to the traditional banner armies with their swords and bows. But this change was not without conflict. Conservative mandarins and generals, their power and prestige tied to the old ways, fiercely resisted. They saw this adoption of foreign methods as a betrayal of their ancestral heritage, a stain on the empire's honor. The court became a battleground of ideas, a struggle between the past and the future, with the very survival of the empire hanging in the balance. As the military and economy were thrown into turmoil, a new and powerful force began to stir within the empire's diverse population: nationalism. For centuries, people identified with their family, their village, or their province. The concept of a single, unified national identity was foreign, but the humiliation of unequal treaties and the looming threat of foreign domination forged a new sense of shared purpose. Scholars and students began to write fiery pamphlets and essays, not just criticizing the foreigners, but also questioning the emperor's divine mandate to rule. They argued that the empire belonged to its people, not to a single dynasty. Secret societies formed in tea houses and back alleys, their members vowing to expel the foreigners and restore the nation's glory. These nationalist movements were a double-edged sword. While they provided a powerful force for resisting foreign encroachment, they also directly challenged the authority of the imperial court, threatening to shatter the empire from within. The empire was now caught in a perfect storm. Externally, it faced the relentless pressure of powerful industrial nations eager to exploit its resources and markets. Internally, it was racked by economic collapse, a painful and divisive military modernization, and the rise of revolutionary nationalism. The emperor, a young man who had inherited a crumbling legacy, found himself trapped. To embrace radical reform was to risk the wrath of the powerful conservative elite and alienate those who cherished tradition. To resist change was to guarantee the empire's eventual demise at the hands of foreign powers. He sat upon the jade throne, surrounded by whispered advice and conflicting reports, the weight of 1,000 years of history pressing down on his shoulders. The air in the jade palace was thick with uncertainty. Every decision was fraught with peril. Every path seemed to lead to disaster. The vast, ancient Kazgarian Empire, a civilization that had once seen itself as the center of the world, was now teetering on the brink of collapse, its future an unwritten page in the turbulent book of history. This story, the fall of the fictional Kazgarian Empire, is a mirror reflecting the real histories of many great civilizations that faced the tidal wave of modernization. From the Ottoman Empire in Turkey to the Qing dynasty in China, the themes are strikingly similar: the clash between tradition and progress, the painful economic and military adjustments, and the birth of nationalism. These weren't simple stories of good versus evil or old versus new. They were complex human dramas filled with brilliant reformers, staunch traditionalists, and ordinary people caught in the crossfire of history. Understanding these transformations is crucial because they didn't just reshape maps, they reshaped the world we live in today. The global economic systems, the political alliances, and even the cultural identities of many nations were forged in the crucible of this period. So, why does this matter to us now? Because the core dilemma of the Kazgarian Empire is a timeless one. How does a society, a company, or even an individual adapt to disruptive change without losing their core identity. We see it today in industries being upended by new technology, in communities grappling with globalization, and in our own lives as we navigate a constantly evolving world. The tension between preserving what we value and embracing the necessity of change is a fundamental part of the human experience. The story of the Cascarian Empire isn't just a history lesson, it's a cautionary tale and a source of profound insight. It reminds us that no institution is too big to fail, that tradition can be both a source of strength and a fatal weakness, and that the forces of change, once unleashed, are nearly impossible to control. By studying these moments of profound historical transition, we can better understand the challenges we face today and perhaps navigate our own futures with a little more wisdom. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you found this story compelling and thought-provoking, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into the fascinating turning points of history. Let me know in the comments which historical empire story you'd like to explore next. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning. Thanks for watching. Have you ever watched a map change color? Not in a single, sudden burst, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, over decades. Imagine a globe from the early 20th century, vast swaths painted in the colors of empires. The deep red of the British Empire, the rich blue of the French, the green of the Portuguese. These colors represented control, a world neatly divided and owned. Now, picture that same globe, but let time flow forward. Watch as a new patch of color appears in Africa, then another in Asia, then a cluster in the Caribbean. Each new hue signifies a birth, a nation shaking off the yoke of colonial rule and claiming its own identity. This is the story of decolonization, a quiet, profound transformation that redrew the world map, not with the ink of cartographers alone, but with the will of millions. The first 2 minutes of this story are often the most dramatic, but we're going to look at it differently. This isn't just about flags being lowered and new ones raised. It's about the deep, underlying currents that pushed history in this direction. Think of the world after World War II. The great colonial powers, Britain and France, were victorious but exhausted. Their economies were shattered, their cities lay in ruins, and their prestige was tarnished. They had fought a war for freedom and democracy, yet they presided over empires where millions were denied those very same rights. The hypocrisy was becoming impossible to ignore, both at home and abroad. The cost of maintaining these empires was astronomical. It wasn't just about stationing troops and administrators in distant lands. It was about building infrastructure railways, ports, telegraph lines, not for the benefit of the local people, but to extract resources more efficiently. Raw materials like rubber, tin, cotton, and oil flowed from the colonies to the factories of Europe, fueling industrial economies. But this system was becoming increasingly expensive and unstable. The war had shown that these territories were vulnerable. Japan's swift conquests in Southeast Asia had shattered the myth of European invincibility. The people living under colonial rule saw this, and it sparked a powerful idea. If one foreign power could be thrown out, why not another? Let's trace the first major ripples. In 1947, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, India, gained its independence. This was a seismic event. It wasn't just one country. It was a subcontinent. The partition that accompanied it was brutal and tragic, but the message it sent to the world was undeniable. If India could break free, anyone could. The dominoes began to fall. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia fought a bitter war of independence against the Dutch. Vietnam embarked on a decades-long struggle, first against the French, and then the Americans. The map was slowly, but surely, beginning to bleed its imperial colors. The economic logic of empire was also crumbling. The old model of extracting raw materials and selling back manufactured goods was being challenged. Newly independent nations wanted to build their own industries, control their own resources, and trade on their own terms. The colonial powers, weakened and in debt, often found it was simply cheaper to grant independence than to fight costly, unwinnable wars to maintain control. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was a turning point, when Britain and France, along with Israel, invaded Egypt to retake the Suez Canal. They were forced into a humiliating withdrawal by pressure from the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a stark declaration that the old imperial powers were no longer the main players on the world stage. A new bipolar world had emerged, and both the US and the USSR, for their own strategic reasons, generally supported the end of the old European empires. This political shift was mirrored by a moral one. The idea of racial and cultural superiority that underpinned colonialism was being dismantled. The United Nations, formed in the ashes of the war, enshrined the principle of self-determination in its charter. Activists and intellectuals from the colonies and the metropoles alike began to speak out more forcefully against the injustices of empire. Voices like Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, and Mahatma Gandhi gave powerful expression to the aspirations of the colonized, their words echoing in university halls in Paris and London as much as in the marketplaces of Dakar and Calcutta. They argued that colonialism wasn't just politically oppressive and economically exploitative. It was psychologically damaging, stripping people of their culture, their history, and their dignity. As the 1960s dawned, the winds of change, as British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan called them, blew with unstoppable force across Africa. It was the Year of Africa. Imagine the map again, that vast, uniformly colored continent suddenly erupting into a mosaic of new flags and new names. They drained the coffers of the colonial powers, who had to fund massive military campaigns thousands of miles from home. The Vietnam War, for instance, cost France and later the United States billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives, ultimately ending in failure. Generations were lost to conflict, economies were wrecked, and deep social divisions were often left behind, sometimes intentionally sown by the departing colonial powers as part of a divide and rule strategy. The political shifts were complex. Independence didn't automatically lead to utopia. The new leaders of these nations faced immense challenges. They had to forge a national identity out of diverse ethnic and religious groups that had been arbitrarily thrown together by colonial borders. They had to build new institutions, governments, schools, hospitals, often from scratch. And they had to do all this while navigating the treacherous waters of the Cold War, with both the US and the Soviet Union vying for influence, offering aid with strings attached, and sometimes propping up dictators who served their interests. The legacy of colonial economies, which were designed for extraction rather than self-sufficiency, often led to cycles of debt and dependency on former colonial powers, a phenomenon known as neocolonialism. Yet, despite all these challenges, the shift was profound and irreversible. The world had fundamentally changed. The old centers of power had to reckon with a new, much more crowded, and much more assertive international community. The United Nations General Assembly, once a cozy club of Western nations, now echoed with voices from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, forming powerful voting blocs and demanding a more equitable world order. This was the era of the non-aligned movement, as countries like India, Egypt, and Yugoslavia tried to steer a third path, independent of both the American and Soviet blocs. As we watch our map finalize its transformation, with the last colonies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific gaining independence through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we see a world that is messy, complex, and far from perfect. It was the moment when the majority of humanity stepped out of the shadow of empire. It's a story of how the world, slowly, painstakingly, changed its colors. If you found this reflection on history interesting, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the stories that have shaped our world. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to live during the final days of a great empire? We often imagine dramatic scenes, epic battles, and cities in flames. But history tells a different story. For most people, life just went on. The sun rose and set. The markets were still filled with the sounds of merchants and the smells of fresh bread. Children still played in the streets, their laughter echoing off ancient stones. The decline wasn't a sudden crash, but a slow, almost imperceptible fading. A ship that was once grand and unsinkable, now taking on water so slowly that no one noticed the decks were getting damp. Think about the Roman Empire. Its fall wasn't a single event. It was a process that spanned generations. A farmer in Gaul or a potter in Britannia probably didn't wake up one morning and think, well, the empire is collapsing today. Instead, he might have noticed the coins in his purse were a little lighter, with less silver than they used to have. Maybe the Roman road that connected his village to the city was unrepaired as quickly after the winter rains. Perhaps the legionaries who used to patrol the frontier looked younger, less disciplined, and spoke in strange accents from far-off lands. These were small things, tiny cracks in a vast mosaic. Life continued. Festivals were celebrated. Marriages were arranged. Babies were born. The grand narrative of imperial collapse was just background noise to the immediate, pressing realities of daily life. It's a strange thought, isn't it, that you could be living through a monumental historical shift and not even realize it. Now, let's bring that thought gently into our own time. We live in an age of breathtaking speed and constant information. Our screens glow with headlines of crisis, change, and uncertainty. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, to feel like we're standing on shaky ground. We hear whispers of systems fraying, of old certainties dissolving. It can feel like the world we knew is changing in ways we can't quite grasp. Much like that Roman farmer noticing the worn-out road, we see the headlines. We feel the anxiety, and we wonder if we too are living in one of those interesting times the history books talk about. The noise of the world can be so loud, so demanding, pulling our attention in 1,000 different directions. It's enough to keep anyone awake at night, replaying the worries, trying to make sense of a story that feels too big to comprehend. But just like that farmer, our lives are also made up of small, tangible moments. The warmth of a cup of tea in your hands, the sound of rain against the window pane, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. These things are real. They are present While the grand, sweeping tides of history are powerful, they do not erase the beauty and importance of our individual lives. The laughter of a loved one, a moment of kindness from a stranger, the satisfaction of a day's work done. These are the anchors that hold us steady. The world has always been in a state of flux. Empires rise and fall like the tides. Civilizations bloom and fade like flowers in a garden. This is the natural rhythm of things, a cycle as old as time itself. And through it all, humanity endures. We adapt, we rebuild, we find new ways to connect, to create, to love. The end of one thing is always the beginning of something else. When the old Roman roads crumbled, new paths were forged. When the central authority faded, new communities, new kingdoms, and new ideas rose from the old foundations. It wasn't an end, but a transformation, a long, slow, and often messy process of becoming something new. There is a deep, quiet strength in that, a resilience that is woven into the very fabric of our being. We are the descendants of countless generations who navigated their own uncertain times, who faced their own fading empires, and who carried the spark of life forward. That same strength, that same capacity for hope and renewal resides within you. So as you lie here now, ready for sleep, let go of the grand, unsolvable puzzles of the world. They are too heavy to carry into your dreams. Instead, turn your attention inward to the quiet stillness within you. Feel the weight of your body sinking into the mattress, a feeling of safety and support. Notice the gentle rise and fall of your chest with each breath, in and out. A steady, peaceful rhythm. This breath has been with you every moment of your life. A constant, faithful companion. It asks nothing of you, only that you allow it to flow. Let each exhale be a release. Release the worries of the day. Release the headlines and the noise. Release the need to understand everything. Let them all drift away like leaves on a slow-moving stream. Imagine the great, silent turning of the earth. As one half of the world is bathed in sunlight, your half is turning into the soft, quiet darkness of night. It is a time for rest, a time for restoration, a time for the world to be quiet so that you can find your own quiet. The stars are wheeling overhead in their ancient, silent dance. They have watched empires rise and fall, forests grow and recede, mountains rise and wear away. They are witnesses to the immense, slow, and patient rhythms of the universe. And you are a part of that rhythm, a precious, unique part of this vast and beautiful cosmic dance. There is no need to struggle tonight. There is nothing you need to solve. Your only task now is to surrender to the gentle pull of sleep. Allow your mind to become soft and spacious. If thoughts arise, just notice them, like clouds passing in the night sky, and let them go. Return your focus to your breath, the simple, peaceful sensation of air entering and leaving your body. Feel the stillness growing around you and within you, a deep, profound peace that has been waiting for you all day. This is your time to heal, to recharge, and to dream. The world and all its complexities will be there tomorrow. But for now, there is only this moment, this breath, this peace, the slow, gentle fade into a deep and restorative sleep. Rest now. You are safe. You are at peace. Sleep well.